So Michael, could you pick it up from here and tell us about your work in Ukraine and also, I guess it was Madagascar and Bulgaria, as I recall.
Yeah, that's that. There are a lot of countries in there, but I'll
Right.
wrap it all in. Yeah, and thank you. And compared with Malachy and his team, my reporting, I think our reporting is much more low tech and old school. It sort of began as an attempt to understand kind of the nature and motivation behind Russian intelligence operations. And this came primarily what inspired the project, were on the one hand, the 2016 interference in the presidential election in the United States, but also another Russian intelligence operation, the 2018 poisoning of a former Russian spy for the British in the UK by the name of Schwirtz. And what I had wanted to do was get a sense of some of the personalities and the policies behind some of these these intelligence efforts that were going on all around the world. And while the 2016 election, the 2018 poisoning garnered a lot of attention, they were just sort of the most visible examples of a huge amount of intelligence activity that had been carried out around Europe, the Middle East, Africa for the last few years, and represented sort of an aggressive push by the Kremlin to make itself more relevant in international affairs using means that were in many ways underhanded, but also very accessible and commensurate with Russia's abilities. When you're dealing with the intelligence world, it's usually nebulous. So if you look at sort of the collection of stories, they touch on a number of different issues, from kind of pure intelligence operations, military operations, political disinformation operations. But going throughout this project, we chose to dig in wherever an opening appeared for us. So if you look, for instance, at kind of one of the first big story I did in this series was a story about a Russian hitman, and this was very much born of my interest in the subject after the 2018 Skripal poisoning, and I came across this story almost by accident. I had been in Ukraine digging around on the issue of Russian assassinations, because Ukraine is very much a testing ground for this type of activity. In fact, a lot of the intelligence operations that we've seen demonstrated in the West, from election interference to hacking critical infrastructure to assassinations, was first carried out in Ukraine. So I figured this would be a good place to go. And I was sort of beating my head against a wall, as I normally do in these sorts of projects, getting nowhere, when somebody happened to mention to me this trial that was going on in a very small town in the west of Ukraine, involving a hitman who had murdered somebody seemingly sort of unimportant. He was an engineer, a kind of handyman at a local prison. And it sounded interesting to me. I had nothing else going on, and so I decided to go out there and check it out. And that turned into a story that allowed me, almost with exclusively with this guy's help, allowed me to unpick a bit about how Russia carries out these assassination operations. And what I learned, kind of the big idea that I learned in that story, is that very often, one is that Russia is carrying out these sorts of operations all the time, particularly in Ukraine and the areas on its borders. These sorts of assassinations are not terribly uncommon. What was uncommon is that, I was looking for, highly trained professional intelligence officers of the kind that were involved in this Skripal poisoning in the UK. And what I found was a kind of petty criminal and a sex trafficker who happened to have been at the right place in the right time to be recruited by Russian intelligence and sent on this mission to murder a man with a promise of payment of a few $1,000s and a Mercedes van. And this, I discovered, was a much more common, sort of low grade, almost criminal style, these low grade criminal style murders that were taking place all over this part of the world. That was one story. I did another story. Another story took me to Madagascar, and this is a totally different story. And in fact, a story that was similar to ones that we were doing out of the United States. And this one involved election interference and a huge number of Russian political operatives that were sent, thousands of miles away from Moscow to interfere in an election in Madagascar. This is a different, this story sort of highlighted a different side of the Russian effort to expand its influence all around the world. And what this involved was just a series of political consultants that branched out and reached out to all of the major candidates in the Madagascar election and offered to assist them in winning the election. And they zeroed in on a specific candidate and ended up focusing on the wrong candidate, in fact. And sort of a lot of these stories that we did, they certainly highlighted the breadth of Russian operations all around the world and Russian efforts to expand its influence, but they did not necessarily highlight or underscore a great deal of competence on their part. So in this Madagascar story, what ended up occurring is the Russians backed the wrong guy. The guy that they pumped resources in, providing hundreds of thousands of dollars for to win this election, in an effort to gain some kind of influence in this very uninfluential country, ended up going south. They ended up backing the wrong guy and having to shift gears and try and curry favor with the man who actually won after the fact. And then I eventually did get around to doing a few more stories about sort of high-level assassinations carried out by the Russian government, and zeroed in on a unit that the Russians had developed to not only carry out assassinations, but carry out these kind of destabilizations all over the world. The unit was designated 29155 as a member of the Russian military intelligence service. And basically their job is to go around the world, go around Europe, and attempt to assassinate enemies of Russia, and or carry out operations aimed at destabilizing various countries in the region. So I focused on Bulgaria, where this group attempted twice to poison a Bulgarian arms dealer who was doing business with some of Russia's enemies, particularly Ukraine. These groups were also involved. This group was also involved in the Skripal poison, which I mentioned, as well as an attempted coup in Montenegro, and they continue to sort of carry out operations and are active around Europe to this day, as far as we know. We're sort of still getting bits and pieces of information about things they might be up to at current time. So we might have some future stories on those as well. And so really just to sum up, and I'll pass it on to Dionne and David so they can talk about their really, really interesting reporting. And basically, the goal here was to reveal the inner workings of the Kremlin's push to extend its influence abroad, using an array of tools from the military, the intelligence services, to political operations, and sort of dissect those in different places all over the world.
That sounds great. And before we go on to you, Dionne, I just wanted to say one thing. You're talking about old school versus maybe new school. There's a lot of wonderful stuff in your old school reporting. I'm putting the old school in quotes, by the way. And I thought the character, the assassin in Ukraine, was something out of a Russian novel, in the sense that here's this low-level guy who's about to commit this assassination. And what's he thinking about? He's thinking about, well, maybe I'll get a pension. It's like all these bizarre things that seem totally unrelated to the horror that's about to be perpetrated. So a lot of great quotes in that, as well as your other ones. So thank you so much.
Thank you.